Okay, given these interest rates I have, let's see what happens. Again, I'm not going to worry about the difference between borrowing and lending rates. I can borrow enough money so that if I invested that at 4.1% for 1 year, I will have 1 million in 1 year. Okay. Well, figuring that out is not that difficult. Come on. Nope. So I need to borrow 960,615. So if I borrow that much money invested at 4.1%, rounded to the nearest dollar, I'm going to have exactly $1 million in my account. Good. That's basically the present value at the 1 year rate. All right. But I borrowed $1 million, but I can only borrow that money for 2 years. Remember, nobody's lending me money. I mean, I can borrow for 1 year, or, or I can take my chance what the interest rates are going to be in the future. I don't want to do that. Borrow 1 million at the 2 year rate, or not borrow. I'm borrowing that 960, 620 at the 2 year rate, which means I'm going to pay back 960, 615 times 1 plus the 2 year rate, but squared, right? Let's calculate that. Nine 60. That makes 107.04. This is the cost of doing the poor man's forward. Okay? Now, these are your two alternatives. If you go to your forward bank, it's going to cost you 40. That was simple, assuming that's what your bank quotes. If you do the poor man's forward, it's going to cost you 37. Do I even have to ask you which one would you do? No, you're going to do the poor man's forward. That means the bank is charging you too much. Well, let's think about the market forces. If bank is charging you too much, or if bank says, I can even lend you at, I can even borrow from you at 4%, you're going to say, I'll do it in the poor money market, poor man's money market, and I'll lend it to you. I'll make money. That means there's going to be a pressure on the forward rate to go down. There's going to be a pressure on the other rates to go up until the equilibrium establishes. So that's what determines the forward rates. Why do you think this so-called arbitrage-free fair forward rate should be 3.70%? That kind of sounds odd. The current 1-year rate is 4.1, current 2-year rate is 3.9, but the rate the markets should commit to is 3.7. Why do you think so? Let's kind of have a discussion about that. Because on Wednesday, we're going to talk about the term structure. That's why I wanted to do this first. It's going to link up with that pretty well. Let's think about the little graph. 1 year, 2 years. Why would the 2-year rate be lower than the 1-year rate? There may be a lot of reasons, but why do you think so? Yes, doesn't matter what it is. I mean, currently, market says 2-year rate is going to be lower than the 1-year rate. Currently, the market says 2-year rate is lower than the 1-year rate, despite 2 years having more uncertainties. Does that tell you anything about market may be expecting? What does it? Market is basically thinking next year 1-year rates are going to be even lower. Okay, for whatever reasons, economy, this, that, because as that as somebody who could borrow for who needs to borrow for 2 years, I can either borrow right now for 2 years, or I can borrow 1 year, take a risk, renew that loan next year. If I expect that rates are going to be 1-year rates are going to be lower next year, I'm going to choose the second one. Well, that kind of creates that. Okay? Market says we are expecting the rates to go down. That's why the forward rate is lower. It doesn't mean that next year's 1-year rate is going to be 3.7. But right now, that is the market clearing expected rate. Okay? So market thinks 1-year rates are going to be significantly lower next year. That's very useful information when you're managing these kinds of risks. That's why these forward markets are very important. Okay? And the shape of even the longer version of the so-called term structure tells us a lot of stories. I mean, let me show you right now what the, not as a graph, but look at 5-year rates for treasuries is 4.09, which is slightly lower than the 1-year rate. And remember, I mean, we're going to talk about that in next chapter, but the longer is the maturity of a bond, there is added so-called interest rate risk. So despite that, 5-year rates are either the same or slightly lower than the 1-year rate. That means market is in a pessimistic mood in terms of what they think economy could be. Again, we could talk all sorts of conjunctural stuff right now, all this tariff stuff, political uncertainty, what have you. But market thinks that Fed is going to be pushed to reduce interest rates. And we got to be able to read all of these, right? And that's why I wanted to kind of get started. We'll continue with the rest of this chapter on Wednesday. And remember, Jeopardy is next week. I'll see you guys Wednesday. Just a second. Let me make sure that I saved.